sticks, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is my regular co-host, Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum, Jay Carson. Good morning, Jay. And I should say, Jay swooped in. I don't know if you swooped in, but essentially I was going to do the show with Kristen this week, but she came down with a bad cold that I guess turned into bronchitis, and she was just not in a good way, and she was willing to go on and do it, but I told her, get your rest, and called up Jay, and at literally 10 minutes notice, Jay said, absolutely, I'm ready to go. So thank you,
Jay. Ready to step in to save America. Yeah, Mike, I was, as most Republicans like me at this time of year, I was going to be washing my yacht this morning, but I was almost on my way to do that, but then duty calls, so here I am.
That is the kind of just spirit that absolutely just wonderful. But another thing I wanted to mention before we get started is, normally when you and I are doing the show, Jay, about halfway through, I take a minute to thank our newest Patreon supporters and ask people maybe if they want to consider being supporters. And
That's awfully nice of you.
I was thinking about that, and I've listened to a lot of podcasts, and I realized if someone broke up a show I was listening to do that, I would feel mildly annoyed, or maybe a little more, because that's actually happened, and that's how I felt. And so I thought, why don't I not do that? Instead, why don't I just thank folks at the beginning, make any announcements we need to make, and then that way people can just enjoy the show all the way through. So, that sound good to you, Jay?
That sounds fine to me.
Well, then that's what we're going to do. And so we do want to thank our newest Patreon monthly supporter, and that is Robert. Robert, thank you so much. And of course, when you become a monthly supporter of the show through Patreon, you get our thanks, but you also get access to a bunch of stuff, our weekly bonus show, and a number of other things that we put together. In fact, Jay, there's a new thing that I'm kind of excited to tell folks about, and this is going to be available to all Patreon supporters. So I'm a big fan of movies, all kinds of movies, and now you are too, Jay, right?
Absolutely, yes.
So on Tuesday, in a couple days here, I'm actually starting a new class, teaching a new class at NKU called Dystopian Politics in Film. And I thought, why don't I try to kind of bring as much as I can of this experience to some of the supporters, because every week I was going to talk about a couple of films and put some questions up for people to talk about. And I thought, maybe supporters might enjoy doing that. So I'm going to start doing that. Yeah. And so folks, if you're interested, I guess I should let people know what the films are, right? That might be helpful. So this coming week, we're going to be talking about Planet of the Apes, the original one from '68, and Escape from New York, one of my all-time favorite movies. I love that movie. That's going to be followed by Blade Runner, RoboCop, The Matrix, V for Vendetta, Idiocracy, and Snowpiercer. So if you're interested in hearing my comments on all of those films and also maybe getting involved in some discussions, you can do that by going to our Patreon page. It's patreon.com/politicsguys. And if you are a supporter, the audio commentary will be right there in your supporter RSS feed. And, I hope you enjoy it. All right. Well, with that out of the way, we are ready to get on with the show. You ready, Jay?
I'm ready.
All right. Well, let's do it. So we start today with the latest in Trump investigations, including Attorney General William Barr's investigation of the investigators. Now, the Trump strategy, Jay, as you and I have talked about last week, is basically been to fight essentially all these information requests. And legally, it doesn't really seem all that promising, that argument that, the administration can refuse to turn over documents or to prevent the president's bankers or accountants from providing them when the administration decides it's not related to a legitimate legislative purpose. That really goes against a large body of precedent. And,
sure,
and of course, most legal experts, even on the right, don't really expect the administration to have a lot of success ultimately, again, legally, with these arguments. Jay, and you would more or less agree with that, right?
Yeah, I do to an extent, and I guess it depends on which investigations and which requests we're talking about.
Yeah, there are a lot of them, absolutely.
I think we've discussed before the idea of Congress getting the president's tax returns. Look at the way I read the statute. I think it's an incredibly dumb law. It may even have been a bill of attainder at the time. The statute gives the right to the House Finance Committee to get tax returns of any person it sees fit. And I think that's a tough, I'm not sure how you get around that statute. Some of the others, as you mentioned, that, is it a proper subpoena? Again, there's going to be sort of a wide strike zone that the courts are going to give to that as far as, proper legislative purpose.
Yeah.
So those are, but when you get into some of the other issues, for example, testimonial privilege, who has to show up and testify, who can be subpoenaed to appear, and you get into things like executive privilege, I think the president has a stronger case in a lot of those requests.
And there's one argument that actually I think that Congress's case is already pretty strong, but one way almost certainly to strengthen it would be to start a formal impeachment inquiry, which is different. And I think people kind of get these terms kind of confused, but an impeachment inquiry is not actually impeachment. It's simply that the House would vote to have, an inquiry into impeachment made by the Judiciary Committee, and that can be done without actually voting to impeach the president.
Right. And what do you think? What do you think they'll find if they do that inquiry?
Well, my point is,
what do you think they'll come up with?
Well, my point is from a legal standpoint.
Yeah. When
you're talking about a legitimate legislative purpose, one of the administration's arguments is that there's no way or they don't see how Congress could legislate on this. Now, that argument totally falls apart when you're talking about actually considering impeaching the president.
Right. No, the question is, give me a good reason why you need this stuff.
Exactly.
Other than just hassling me.
Yeah, and I think there's already a good enough reason, but this makes it much stronger.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. If they were to begin impeachment proceedings, that would be a good reason. I think they would be able to do that.
Yeah. But I think politically,
but there's an obvious issue there.
Yeah. I think politically the problem would be, and again, there's a difference between launching an inquiry and beginning impeachment and voting, out of the Judiciary Committee to have the impeachment kind of process move forward. But I think that distinction is going to get lost.
Well, I think as a practical matter, once you've initiated the launch sequence, you can't stop it.
I
think
disagree with
that's the issue that House Democrats, I think, are facing already.
Yeah. I see what you're saying. Well, that kind of gets into
I think you can't say, okay, we're going to have an impeachment investigation and then decide not to impeach.
I would think at least.
I mean politically, not legally.
I see.
Obviously you can, but I'm just saying the political pressure would be tremendous. And just because, and again, this is sort of the dilemma Democrats are facing already, that you sort of get up and go through, these are the litany of the horrible things Donald Trump has done and shredding the Constitution and so forth, to which their base responds, well, what are we going to do about it? And that's the issue.
See, I think there are some Democrats who feel that way and who would vote to impeach no matter what. But I also think that there are a good number of Democrats, like the sort of folks who, won in kind of middle of the road districts, who gave the Democrats their majority in the current Congress, who would not be nearly as likely to do that because it wouldn't be, number one, I don't know if the evidence would support it necessarily, and that's obviously, it should be important. And number two, I don't know that it would be in their electoral best interest. So I think I disagree with you a little bit on that issue. I think there might be enough votes.
I've said it before, and I'll say it again. The House will impeach Trump. All Democrats will vote for impeachment.
Okay, and I will take that bet, because you are.
And again, they not necessarily willingly, but I really think it is sort of The launch sequence has started, and I don't know how they can stop it at this point.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I completely disagree with you on that, but we will find out, I'm sure.
Okay, watch as it keeps playing out.
Yeah, absolutely. So, another part of this, you mentioned Bill of Attainder a little bit before, and New York State's done something sort of interesting. The legislature passed the bill that would essentially allow New York State to provide the state income tax returns of Donald Trump to specific congressional committees. Now, this was not written with Donald Trump's name specifically involved. Right. It was written, to include a wide kind of
Bills of Attainder are.
Yeah, exactly. So it would apply to a large number of federal officials essentially. So it's not a bill of attainder, but pretty clearly it was drawn up specifically to allow Congress to look at Donald Trump's New York State tax returns. And of course, since, his businesses are in New York State, this would reveal not everything that was in his federal returns, but it certainly would be illuminating. And
I think there's a good argument to say that it is a bill of attainder.
Okay.
And I would expect it to be challenged. So we'll see how that plays out.
But, well, what is that argument, Jay?
Well, the bill is directed to one single person that it's seeking to sort of harass for political reasons.
But if you apply kind of, when we talk about other legislative actions and we talk about intent, or we talk about the intent of the president in doing something like immigration bans, pretty much the standard is to give the benefit of the doubt, and as long as there's any kind of a rational basis for it, then it's okay. And so as long as it doesn't specifically single out the president, anything, and there's a legitimate legislative purpose for doing that more broadly, then I would think that there's no reason why that's impermissible.
Well, I'm not saying it's definitely a bill of attainder. Okay. I'm saying it's challengeable.
Okay, yeah,
and I would expect that it should be challenged.
Yeah, and on that ground,
and I would say it ought to be challenged.
Yeah, and I don't see any problem with that. I think it would lose, and it should. But yeah, absolutely.
But because here's the point. Here's the test. Because it's one of those. Again, if you're trying to write a bill of attainder, you're obviously not going to say this is a bill of attainder to harass Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Right. It's so there's always some sort of, you have to go beyond what that
sure.
the language says, and it's a little different bill of attainder than talking about something like immigration, which is a let's say the travel ban. The argument was, well, this is just thinly veiled racism, religious bigotry, something like that.
Right.
As opposed to when you're looking at, one person.
Yeah.
Now they could say, well, the class of people is larger because it's federal officials from New York, but they've got to. My point is, I would make them, the New York legislature or the governor or whoever, their attorney essentially, walk in and say that with a straight face to the judge.
Sure, and I think they could certainly.
And the judge would look at them and say, "Come on."
And I don't think the judge would say that. I think that you can make the case that there are.
In New York, you may be right, but
no, I think there are plenty of. Well, I think there are plenty of millionaires and billionaires with all sorts of interesting financial holdings where there certainly could be legitimate legislative purpose for them to look at.
Has Congress asked for any of their records?
But they might. Donald Trump has certainly set a precedent by not releasing his tax returns, and I think it's a legitimate concern to say, well, hey, now that other folks see that Trump didn't do it, it would be very easy for them, or it would be easier for them to say, you know what, I'm not going to do it either. It doesn't seem like I pay as much of a political price. And so I think this is a reasonable and prudent piece of legislation.
Oh dear. Well, we'll see. We'll see.
We will.
I would expect that they will challenge it. You're like, I think I tend to agree. You probably lose at the district court level. But I think it would be overturned on appeal.
Well, and again, we're talking about these appeals. As we talked about last week, it seems like the political goal is to stall till after November 2020, essentially. But then there was this weird situation where this week, the president's attorneys and House Democrats reached this agreement for an expedited appellate review of a subpoena for some of his financial documents for one of the firms. Oral arguments now are scheduled for July 12th. And so you can see where if this kind of gets bumped up and you have a decision where this could get a Supreme Court ruling sometime in maybe early to mid 2020 or so, wouldn't be out of the question. So, then again, I think on the other hand, it seems pretty clear to me that Donald Trump is goading the Democrats into impeaching.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And so maybe it's not so much stalling, it's just stonewalling to say, what are you going to do about it? And hey, great, impeach me. And, it reminds me, and this is maybe a racist story. So at least people, I want to mention that, but the Brer Rabbit stories,
Okay.
Brer Rabbit and Tar Baby, that sort of thing. And again, I want to point out these stories.
There was once an Ohio legislator who did something like that and told a whole Brer Rabbit story on the floor of the House.
Wow.
And yes, we were sitting in the gallery and just the jaws drop. And,
yeah.
And again, this was someone who is I would say I certainly had never experienced him as or as a racist. He just sort of told the story without I guess getting some of the other underlying context. But go ahead.
But no, I mean, and actually,
with your
I did some research on that, and I guess apparently it dates to kind of traditional African folk tales, but then it was appropriated by racists and so forth. But anyway, the point being is that, the idea that you're just begging somebody to do this thing that is going to get them involved in a horrible mess that they can't get out of, and it's going to be bad for them and good for you, and that kind of thing. And it just seems to me so obvious. And I got to say, I think that Nancy Pelosi has, Donald Trump is right to respect her, because I think she's done a great job of keeping the Democratic coalition together and kind of keeping them away from the impeachment talk. And that's why I'm a little more confident that it's not going to happen than you are. I have more faith in Nancy Pelosi's abilities, I guess, than you do.
Nancy's hanging on by her fingernails.
I don't think so, but we'll find out. So,
I think you're right, and I'll take off. Sometimes you have to look at these issues from two perspectives. One is kind of wearing the legal hat.
Sure.
Is this a enforceable subpoena? Is it all that sort of stuff? Yeah. Does he win or lose a court? But the bigger picture is, how does it play politically? And my thought is, I think it plays fine for politically for Trump.
Yeah, I agree.
Just entirely. Because most people, I think, the Democrat left very much is concerned about Trump's tax returns. Most people aren't, because again, we sort of had this argument already. Release your tax returns, no, and he didn't, and he was elected. So I think there's not much. I think as the Democrats keep focusing on this, it allows Trump the ability to say, look, I'm trying to get something done for our country. I want to solve these problems. They just want to investigate me.
Sure.
And I think the Democrats are walking right into it.
Yeah, I think it's politically, I totally agree, even though I think there's good reason to have his tax returns. But, and that kind of goes into, you mentioned, I want to do good things for the country. The Democrats are preventing me. That kind of gets into the whole infrastructure thing, right? So earlier, Donald Trump has this agreement in gauzy principle about this $2 trillion over 10-year infrastructure package. And this week, he, depending on who you want to talk about, storms out, throws a tantrum, whatever, basically says, hey, as long as Democrats are doing this, saying I'm engaged in a massive cover-up, I'm not going to work with them on infrastructure. Now, to me, it's pretty clear what's going on here. He made a promise that there was no way he could keep. This gave him a very convenient out, because there was no way to pay for this infrastructure package. No way any of this was going to get through Congress. And so he took the political opportunity to back himself out of it. And, that's what he did. What do you think?
Agreed. Yeah. But yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think there would have been, there's also the argument, though, that, Trump has never necessarily really been a fiscal conservative.
Sure.
So if the argument is, would Trump have balked at spending whatever it was, $1 trillion on infrastructure?
Right.
I don't think so. I think Republicans in the Senate would have.
Yeah, agreed.
And that would be the bigger issue. But on into sort of the devil's advocate, or Trump's advocate, I guess, if you might say, doesn't he have something of a point look, why should I come out here and hold hands and sing Kumbaya when these guys, or after 2 years of being investigated, and the investigator said, I don't see anything that I'm going to press charges on. These folks are calling me a crook.
Sure. And the Democrats would say, well, why don't you cooperate with our legitimate request for information? We think you're covering things up because we think you are a crook. And
his response would be, look, my lawyers and everybody, sat down with Mueller and we had this 2-year process, sure. And he said he wasn't denied anything that he needed.
Yeah, and I think, plenty of people on the left would say, yeah, you got your sort of Republican investigator, and, you got your very friendly attorney. He's a Republican. Yeah, haven't you heard that?
Well, I know he was at one time, but
he's hardly a flaming man of the left out to destroy Donald Trump. And also, I think that Robert Mueller's conclusions, especially regarding obstruction, were, as we talked about in the past, have been incredibly dishonestly spun by the administration. And that's what Congress really wants to get into. And that's what the administration doesn't want them to get into, I would say. But then again, that kind of brings us a little far afield. The other thing I wanted to get your thoughts on, Jay, is the ongoing investigation of the investigators. This is headed by U.S. Attorney John Durham, and that's moving forward. This week, Donald Trump gave Barr the authority to declassify intelligence information that's relevant to the investigation, and he ordered the U.S. intelligence community to promptly cooperate with Barr. And this, of course, a lot of folks on the left are upset about this. House Intelligence Committee Chair Adam Schiff called it un-American. Well, what do you think about this, Jay?
Well, I would think it's to ask the intelligence community to cooperate with the Justice Department investigation doesn't seem to be too shocking. Does it? Especially if this is a situation where the intelligence community might have overstepped its bounds and wandered into domestic political affairs.
Yeah, I understand that argument. I've said from the beginning that I think that if you don't have, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think a lot of intelligence. The intelligence community wasn't really happy about cooperating with the Church Commission back in the 70s sure. either, for some of those same reasons.
Yeah, and I think that as much transparency as is possible, keeping in mind that we need to protect sources and methods and other things, I think that's a good and a healthy thing. But just as Republicans were concerned about politicizing this entire process, now, of course, Democrats are concerned about it. I'm one of them. But in principle, I have no quarrel with Durham's investigation, because I think that in the end, it's not going to result in indictments and findings that this was, illegally or unethically done. I think it's going to, not show that at all. But again, I want to see what the facts show. I'm not wedded to any interpretation just because of, my team or the other team.
Good for you.
And I would assume you're not either, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So moving on, we haven't talked about Iran lately, but I think it's time that we should, because of course tensions have been heating up really for the last few weeks in particular. The groups with ties to Iran have attacked shipping in the Persian Gulf. There was that rocket attack near the embassy in Baghdad. And even though Iran is denying those, they're with proxy groups that are closely allied to them. And the intelligence community, which we were just speaking about, says there's been a pretty significant increase in credible threats to U.S. personnel in the region. And even though, there are some congressional Democrats in that all Congress briefing said, well, I think we're exaggerating the threat, basically, and that it's a way to lay the groundwork for a potential preemptive strike. And they see that as more likely especially after the recent deployment of the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group into the area. And now there's some talk that we're going to get more troops in the Middle East. In fact, I think recently there was an announcement about an increase of something like 1,000,
1,500 or something.
1,500, yeah. Now, to kind of give a greater context to this, of course, this all stems from the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from that multilateral Iran nuclear agreement. And that's a little more, I think, than a year ago, in which U.S. sanctions were lifted in exchange for Iran halting development of its nuclear weapons program. And independent inspectors found no Iranian violations of the agreement, but the Trump administration felt that it was, in their words, a bad deal, or probably the worst deal ever. I don't know. But right, but that more could be.
Deal.
But essentially, the argument is that more could be accomplished by squeezing Iran's economy. And there's no question, Jay, that this squeezing has definitely happened. Since the sanctions were put in place, Iran's oil exports have fallen by more than half. Inflation's shot up to 40%. The Iranian rial has lost around 60% of its value against the dollar. Their unemployment rate is over 12%. And there are estimates that their economy as a whole is going to shrink by somewhere around 6% this year. So they're in pretty dire straits. And in fact, the Iranian government recently announced that it's going to stop complying with parts of the agreement unless it receives relief from these sanctions. So that's kind of the strategy. What do you think about it?
I think it's, if remember, we talked about this a year ago, and you and I actually were in agreement that our pulling out of the treaty was probably not going to make any real changes to Iran, and the fear was, and I think both you and I shared it, that even if we leveled sanctions, our European allies would not. But that really didn't happen. The Europeans did, for the most part. I think have cut off Iran and are sort of honoring the path we're taking. So I think the sanctions have had a bigger impact than certainly either you or I would have expected. And look, I'm in the camp that the Iranian regime is despicable. They are the world's biggest state sponsor of terror. I don't find their leadership trustworthy. And I think this is a problem that we deal with long term. And if there's a way to accomplish some sort of regime change in Iran, or to get them back to the table to get a better deal, I think that's a good thing to do. There was an interesting report a week or so ago, and I think this might have happened on a week that I wasn't doing the show. That some of this Iranian saber rattling has come from their misreading that the U.S. was planning an imminent attack. And again, I wouldn't rule out that there might be military action at some point, but there was, we were not planning an imminent attack, at least as far as I know. Not that everyone shares these things with me, but that I think they are there at this point in really struggling because of the sanctions, so they're sort of lashing out.
Yeah, well, that's partly. I think that's one legitimate concern. Some of the Iranians, especially the hardliners, might say, "Hey, if this keeps up, we're just going to be in a weaker and weaker position. So maybe the thing to do is to fight back now, ramp up our nuclear program. I mean, estimates are it could take as little as a year. And so we could have a situation potentially where Iran just gears up for war, and a year from now has a nuclear weapon or two, and all of a sudden we have a truly disastrous situation. I mean, and of course that was always the risk, one of the risks involved with this. But another point I want to make,
or if they just didn't comply with the treaty.
Yeah, but they had been complying with the treaty. So that was the Obama administration's bet, basically saying that, well, we'll keep them from getting the nukes, and they will gradually liberalize and so forth. That was a different logic, certainly.
Yeah.
But I also wonder, and this I think it's a reasonable point to bring up about the long-term strategy, the strategy of basically trying to strangle someone's economy, our country's economy, into compliance. Now, it's pretty clear, and I think you would agree, that the people in charge in Iran are fully committed to anti-Americanism and basically a wholehearted rejection of most liberal Western values, right?
That sounds like them, yeah.
I mean, they cannot sustain themselves in power if they become friendly with the United States. It seems almost inconceivable, right?
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, not friendly, but yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering then, when I think about our past attempts to try to use sanctions to get countries to do what they want, I think about, it hasn't worked in Cuba or North Korea through it's over half a century, well over half a century now. It doesn't seem to be necessarily working all that well in Venezuela, though that's still a newer kind of thing. But, I'm certainly there's good reason to be skeptical about this strategy. We've tried it, and like I said, Cuba and North Korea are probably the most high-profile examples. And as long as there's somebody else willing to kind of prop them up, in this case it would be, Russia, I think that the long-term outlook is certainly not necessarily nearly as positive as a lot of people might think, that we can somehow bring them to heel.
Yeah. Sounds like you're saying we should go ahead and bomb them.
I'm definitely not saying that. I am not channeling John Bolton here. I think you.
No, I'm joking, but I'm also raising sort of a little bit of a serious point in that when you're dealing with bad actors in other states, you sort of have only so many tools in the toolbox, and there's diplomacy, and there's economic sanctions, and there's military action.
Yeah, absolutely.
So.
And Trump has decided that diplomacy is just not an option that he wants to go with, right? And that's the Obama.
I don't know that diplomacy necessarily works with, as you pointed out, an Iranian
sure, anti-Western,
they're pretty much bent on our destruction, and maybe diplomacy works to the extent you can get some kind of leverage or pressure on them, and there's two ways to do that, and one's economic, the other's military.
Yeah, and some might argue that a better way to kind of deal with this is if you cut off the support from their proxy, or not from their proxy, but from their main supporter, Russia. But of course, we have our own issues with Russia on that, and that's not going to happen. But it kind of comes back to, and you and I have talked about this before, people are looking for, I think, sometimes a magic bullet approach, and there just are not a lot of good approaches, because of course diplomacy seems like a long shot. I think economic sanctions don't seem necessarily all that promising given the current configuration. And also that idea of just kind of military invasion. I think one of our big lessons from Iraq, which was a much simpler situation in so many ways, is that, boy, that can sure bring you a ton of unintended consequences. And so in this case, I think Donald Trump's instincts about not getting involved in military confrontations, I think they're pretty good instincts on this.
Okay.
So anyway, we will see. All right, moving on to our next story. This week, 20 states filed suit against the Trump administration's so-called conscience rule, which gives healthcare providers, insurers, and employers who provide health insurance a greater ability to refuse to provide or to pay for medical services that they say violate their religious or moral beliefs. Now, the rule is set to take effect at the end of July, though it's almost certain, I'd say, that there's going to be an injunction blocking it from going into effect while it's being litigated. Now, the argument of the states is that the rule impermissibly favors the interests of providers and employers over patients, particularly women and the LGBTQ community, and that it's going to result in significant discriminatory barriers to access to some basic medical care. And this new rule goes further than just restoring the conscious objections to kind of back to where they were in the George W. Bush era,
right,
because it allows broader grounds for refusing service, and it also strengthens enforcement. Back in 2017, an executive order, President Trump created an Office of Conscience and Religious Freedom as part of the Health and Human Services Civil Rights Office. So clearly there's much more of a focus on this. This has been kind of an issue, particularly of Vice President Pence. So what do you think about this new conscience rule, Jay?
I guess I don't understand why. Well, first of all, let's look at it from the legal aspect.
Sure.
I think it's going to be hard to make a showing that there is this irreparable harm is going to occur. That doesn't mean the district court won't grant an injunction, but I'm not sure that there's a showing that medical services would be unavailable to people because of this. I think that's just a really sort of far-fetched kind of argument. And also look, I mean, a conscience clause I think is important if you want. I mean, because you're not in any way an abortion extremist,
right?
And I think you could agree. There could be someone who wants to go into the healthcare field because look, we want to help people, we want to save lives.
Sure.
But they view abortion as the taking of a human life, and they don't want to be put in a position of, look, you can only serve people and you can only do these other life-saving things if you agree that you will also perform these services which you sure. believe are morally abhorrent. I don't think that's.
Well, let me give you for instance, maybe, and I think this might help to bring it into I don't know, a little more of a real world context, maybe not, but let's say that there's a woman in Cincinnati, where I'm from, who wants to get the Plan B morning after pill, right?
Okay.
And so now, if she's living in my community, well, she goes to the Walgreens right by my house, and the pharmacist says, "Sorry, I can't dispense that. It's against my religious beliefs," and she can go to a Walgreens 2 minutes away, literally, and right. just get it from that or from another pharmacist at that Walgreens. So,
right.
That's not really that much of, I'll use the words undue burden, which is kind of the test that, the court used in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And so, okay, but let's say you're talking about a small town, a tiny little community, which maybe only has one pharmacy, one pharmacist, and all of a sudden, this woman is in a very different situation, and there is a much greater burden put upon her access to, that prescription, or, it could be other healthcare services as well. And so I think it can be a difficult question. So I understand that I am not unsympathetic to the legitimate conscious objections of people, but that balance is a tricky one. And I think probably that the Trump administration I agree that the Trump administration probably errs too much on the side of, the folks who have the conscience objections.
Yeah, I guess my point is in the real world, in the example you gave, if you have a lot of, or whatever, if the service is hard to find in a certain place, the market will step in and find a way to fill it, right? If the need is going unmet, the market will step in.
Oh, I totally disagree with that, at least in these instances, because it wouldn't necessarily be, I mean, it's just like how there are so many people with those what are called orphan drug syndromes, right? Where basically there's not a whole lot of development and prices are high because so no, I think there's a class of people in certain areas where there isn't a good market solution for that. And, in some small town with one pharmacy, one pharmacist, it's not like Walgreens going to say, hey, we can make $200 a month with these Plan B prescriptions. Well, we should set up an entire pharmacy for that. That doesn't, so I don't necessarily agree with that. I think in an ideal world, yeah, but you need enough of a strong user base or consumer base for that to happen. And I think there are plenty of parts of rural America, especially where that's just not the case. And I think we've seen that certainly with the provision of abortion services, where in some small towns and so forth, it's a real burden.
Well, and I guess that gets back to the question then, though, is that a government imposed burden?
How so?
Well, I mean, if the idea is you're just letting someone follow their own conscience, right? Is that the same as the government saying we are banning?
I see what you're saying.
It's not that there is a governmental entity or a state actor saying we are not allowing you to have this service.
It's not directly right. It's not directly doing it, but indirectly, it's certainly imposing a burden. But and again,
and because look, you could make that argument, and people will. But I grew up in, there was a world before Starbucks. Remember?
Yes, I do.
And there was like, and I can remember when you and I were in DC, that was actually one of the first times I ever had cappuccino, like, fancy coffee. And upon returning then to Northeast Ohio, I was stunned and depressed by the lack of fancy coffee available to me. And it's just because nobody was doing it,
yeah.
right? But it's not that, the government had said you cannot serve this. It just wasn't popular,
sure.
but it became that way, and people stepped in, and now you've got one on every corner.
Yeah, and like I said, I love markets, and I think to a certain extent that would happen at least in moderate to larger size areas, but in some small areas it would create a problem. And I think, neither of us, I don't think, are real extremists on this. We understand that there's a balance here, and I don't want to tell somebody you have to provide this service if you feel like you are, ending a life, basically. And so this is not an easy question, certainly, and I think reasonable people can come at different answers to where that balance should lie, basically.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, let's put it this way: there are, in my job, there are cases that I won't take.
Right.
There are people who will take those cases.
Right.
And I think that's, again, we're talking about someone's civil rights, depending, but I think that's just an important. Once you start down that road of everyone must take this, I think you're going to have fewer people going into that profession.
No, I get that. And like I said, it's just a question of how do we deal with those situations where there doesn't seem to be a good alternative, and there pretty clearly is a substandard or a greater burden. And that's not an easy question to answer, certainly. You would agree with that, right?
No, I agree. Yeah.
Okay. And there was kind of a related story too. This was later this week. The administration proposed to revise another Obama-era rule, this one that included gender identity as a form of sex discrimination. Now, this rule applies to, the Obama rule, that is, applies to a provision of the Affordable Care Act that prohibits discrimination based on race, color, national origin, sex, age, or disability. That's pretty standard, just anti-discrimination.
That's been the law for quite a while, yeah.
So, but what the Obama rule did is it defined gender identity, first off, as a person's internal sense of gender, which may be male, female, neither, or a combination of male or female, and which may be different from an individual's sex assigned at birth. And then it also said that, gender identity is part of sex for the purposes of defining sex discrimination. Now, the Trump administration's position is that the Obama rule goes past what Congress understood as part of sex discrimination when it passed the ACA. And so therefore, essentially, it's executive overreach, basically. Is that a fair characterization, would you say?
I think so.
And what do you think about that position?
Well, I think it is executive overreach. And look, you can argue the wisdom or lack thereof of including gender identity, but I think it's tough to fit that into the box of sex. And it's almost like, really, I mean, so many people who are in that community, and I actually know some, make a big difference between, sex is one thing and your gender is something else. So if Congress had meant that or wants to mean that or wants to change it, I think Congress certainly can. I don't think the administration, Elizabeth, I do think the administration would be rewriting the statute or expanding it beyond what was passed otherwise.
Yeah.
And again, that's not getting into the wisdom of whether it's a good idea or bad idea. But.
Right. Well, on this, I don't think it's going to surprise you, Jay, when I tell you that I agree with you completely. And we've had this conversation in various guises, various forms, where you can be for the underlying idea, but have a problem with the implementation. How it got there. And so in this case, I absolutely would totally favor, I would contribute to the support any sort of movement to include gender identity as part of the standard civil rights anti-discrimination language, but it's not kind of the traditional understanding of it. And so even though I am totally for that, and I think that gender discrimination, again, so be clear, but I think that is executive overreach. And I think once you start to have the executive branch basically redefining words in a way that Congress pretty clearly did not mean for them to be defined, that just sets a bad precedent for, future presidents doing things. And so I am for this proposal, even though I am squarely against gender discrimination. I want to make that entirely clear.
Okay. Well, here's my. I do think there is an argument on the merits, though, that ought to be thrown out there. That should Congress take it up, and that is our discrimination law, as it stands. When we're talking about race, sex, age, so forth, just as a practical standpoint, there are objective qualifications.
Yeah.
If you will,
for inherent characteristics.
Exactly, and it's one thing for gender is, again, it's more subjective, and I think it presents a difficult problem in enforcement, for a number of reasons, and I think that's all the more reason why it ought to be, if there's going to be a change, it ought to be legislatively debated and discussed. And, how do you, believe it or not, Mike, there are people out there who will actually just sue for frivolous stuff just to get money.
No.
And if it's one of these, situations, that you're either want to sue because you've been dismissed, and you say, well, it's because of my gender. What's your gender? Well, I think there's difficulties in proof there, and I'm not saying there isn't a way to do it.
But I hear what you're saying, and I think that raises a reasonable.
Or again, and to be clear, I'm not saying that there isn't actual discrimination out there against people who are transgendered or differently gendered. I'm speaking in terms of how does one prove that? How do you write the statute to prevent someone from just claiming anything when it's a purely subjective?
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think that certainly I think that the argument that, well, you're either a man or a woman and that sort of thing, and that sort of, I just cringe at that, because I think it's pretty clear that gender can sometimes be a fluid thing, kind of along a spectrum and that sort of thing, based on a lot of stuff we know, and sexual preference and so forth. So it is a difficult, kind of nuanced type of topic, and so that's why I think you're right that we do need to have that kind of debate. And we need to get people, I think, on record and and so that's the sort of thing that the legislative purpose is designed to do, and not just have this be done through executive fiat, basically.
Yep.
So there we go. All right. Early this week, Jay, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Kentucky's own, and
your favorite legislator.
There you go. Yep. And Virginia Democratic Senator Tim Kaine, so that's bipartisan, introduced the Tobacco-Free Youth Act, which would raise the national age limit for purchase of tobacco products from 18 to 21, and would additionally require all states pass their own laws raising the limit to 21, with states that don't do that losing some pretty significant federal funding. Now, again, this is Kentucky and Virginia, two of the three biggest.
What do they grow down there, Mike?
Yeah, exactly. Tobacco, Now, the legislation is pretty much guaranteed to get a hearing in the Senate. Mitch McConnell, it's one of his priorities, and it's got wide backing, including from the tobacco industry. Now, there are some, though, who argue that that second provision I mentioned, that mandates that states raise their tobacco purchase age to 21, which only 14 states are currently there, that was put in there as kind of a backdoor to tobacco lobbyists who will be able to push for legislation that favors them. To give you kind of a, for instance on that, Arkansas moved to the age of 21 for tobacco purchases recently. But when they passed their state law, they also included language that prohibited counties and cities from passing their own laws that would further increase the age limit, or that would regulate the sale of flavored tobacco products, including menthol and cigarettes. And it's it's the flavors that are really the big draw, especially for kids. I mean, the vast majority of young tobacco users, I think like 80+%, say that their first experience with tobacco came through some sort of a flavored product. So that's kind of the gateway, if you will. So I guess first off, what do you think about this legislation? I mean, it's pretty clearly, obviously it's a regulation of people's behavior. And I know as a general rule, other things being equal, you're opposed to that, Jay. But what do you think about this one?
I'm sort of on the fence in that, 18 to 21, That was sort of similar to the debate back in the 80s when Congress did sort of the same sort of thing, mandated that states raise the drinking age to 21 in exchange for highway funds.
Right.
And the argument then was, well, you're 18, you can go off and serve your country and die in some foreign country, but you can't have a beer. Mm-hmm. Likewise, this is sort of, well, you're 18 and you can go serve your country. You're old enough to vote, but you're not old enough to decide whether or not you should have a cigarette or e-cigarette. So I've got a little bit of an issue there, right? That said, I don't think it's an unreasonable regulation intrusion. You can quibble over the 18 or the 21, but and I think also the saying that it goes back to the states, I'm fine with that, and I don't necessarily see it as sinister as a plot as you do, because I mean when you're talking about things like prohibiting cities and counties from enacting different regulations, that's pretty standard that most industries want to see, just because otherwise it just becomes so unwieldy.
Sure.
Right. If you've got every city changing, different laws, and you're trying to do business throughout the state, that is an impediment. That is a serious cost, and that goes to any industry.
That's a reasonable point. Yeah.
Well, so I don't think that's necessarily something really sneaky. And also the funny thing about the banning the flavors, we talked about this before. I'm also just sort of a weird thing of a government saying, well, we're going to ban this because you like it, because it tastes good, because consumers want it,
but particularly for kids.
Yeah.
And here my position is that we should be moving toward a future where tobacco usage is just banned, full stop. Now that would have to come in degrees, certainly, but it is a dangerous drug with essentially no positive purposes, basically. And obviously, people point out that, well, if it were some were seeking FDA approval or something like that for it, obviously it would be denied because it's just it's a bad thing, sure. Essentially, right? Now, people are hooked on it, but if we can't ban it, and I realize politically we can't, we should at least try to move toward a future where fewer and fewer people use it, where eventually use will kind of fade away. And this whole vaping thing is just bringing more kids into the fold. And to me, I think age limits are something. And so I'm not saying that, well, this is the bad piece of legislation, but age limits, I don't think are the big thing. It's easy to get around them because the enforcement just isn't there. Let me give you an example. The biggest retailer of tobacco products in the country, in the United States, is 7-Eleven, which kind of surprised me, but it makes sense. In a recent investigation in the state of Oregon, investigators found that 25% of 7-Eleven stores were willing to sell to people under the age of 21. And that comes after 7-Eleven had a number of previous run-ins with enforcement authorities. They had this court-designated agreement.
Under 21 or under 18?
Under 21, because Oregon's age is, they're one of the 14 states that's under 21. Yeah. They had this agreement with the court where they tightened their policies. They did this extensive, supposedly employee training and so forth. And still, it's not going to be a real impediment. To me, the age thing doesn't scare the tobacco companies. The thing that scares tobacco companies are putting the limits on the flavors, putting limits on non-face-to-face sales, because what tobacco companies are looking at is, well, where are our future consumers? We need to build that base in the future, and they're doing it through the vaping, through the flavors, through online sales and so forth. And so the kind of legislation that scares them is like the Pallone-Shalala bill, which was introduced in April of this year. It would prohibit non-face-to-face sales. It would prohibit all of these flavors and a number of other things. And that's the kind of thing I think the industry looks at and says, holy cow, we can't have that. That would really cut down on the number of people who smoke or use tobacco products in the future. And that would be a bad thing for us. So let's get behind this much more innocuous thing to avoid the regulation that would really hurt us, essentially. I mean, because bottom line, Jay, if it's good for the tobacco companies, it's bad for Americans' health, and there's no way around that.
I know. I think you're probably right there, but I'd also just throw out there to some extent, in a free country, can't we just let people make their own health choices, even if those are bad health choices?
Well, and we do to a certain extent, yeah. But we don't let people shoot up heroin. We don't let people do a lot of things that we know are, say, particularly addictive, and they're going to take them down a dangerous path. And not only that, but of course, individual choices have costs to society. And there's no question that the health costs that are incurred by people who make those individual choices to do certain things are borne not just by those people, but by society as a whole to a certain extent.
Well, tell me about it.
So there you go. So yeah, I am not only for this, I would be for much more stringent legislation. Basically, I'm suspicious of everything that big tobacco gets behind, just because, not because they're evil people running these companies, though. I mean, I have a problem with any company that makes its business by hurting people's health, but essentially that it wouldn't be, I mean, their bottom line is selling a lot of this product that is dangerous to humans. That's what my bottom line is too. So there we go. On that kind of health note, I guess that we're kind of running a bit long, but before we do go, I should mention to folks that as soon as Jay and I are done recording this show, we're going to be doing our special supporters exclusive show. And I guess on that, we're going to talk a little bit about Julian Assange, who was recently charged with a number of counts of violating the Espionage Act. And that raises, I think, Jay, you would agree, some interesting First Amendment issues, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That, and also about some television shows of our youth, kind of, and what they mean now, and some interesting politics involved in that, Norman Lear and All in the Family and that sort of thing. Well, maybe a little bit before our time, but still shows that we were familiar with.
Saw them in reruns, certainly.
Yeah, exactly. Saw them in reruns. So if you are a supporter, that should be in your podcast app by the time you hear that. Also, if you're interested in being a supporter and getting all those other supporters-only things, including my upcoming dystopian politics and film thing, just go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/politicsguys. We would appreciate it. And if you got a question, comment, or just want to get in touch with us, mail at politicsguys.com. There's our Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys page. We are also on Twitter at Politics Guys. And hey, if you haven't subscribed to the show yet, we would really appreciate it if you did, and leave recommendations, pass along, word about the show to your friends, neighbors, rivals, nemesis. Yes, I guess that'd be the plural. Anything that we would really appreciate that. All right. The executive producer of the Politics Guys, Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Moreno, and Benji Fishman. Today's show is produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with the new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.